Reach Young Adult Ministry sermons online from Tuesday, June 9th, 2020, featuring a standalone message by guest speaker Taylor Gabbert entitled, Even If, from Daniel 3.
So I'm going to start tonight in a little bit of a weird way, especially for me. I'm going to sing a song. It was an instant classic when it came out, immediately top of the charts. If you know it, please sing along. It goes like this. The bunny, whoa, I love the bunny. I don't love my mom or my dad, just the bunny. All right, that song's from VeggieTales, right? What episode? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Okay. All right, so that's where we're going to be tonight. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 3, and we're going to look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All right, so background on the book of Daniel before we jump in. The book of Daniel, surprisingly, was written by Daniel. Daniel, at the time, he was exiled. The Babylonians attacked the kingdom of Judah 3 times. The first time they attacked, they took Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into exile. And it was not the time that they finally conquered the Israelites, but they took some prisoners. All right, so Daniel is in exile. He's in Babylon. All right, and he's got these 3 friends. And what are their names? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's actually wrong. Their names, if you look in chapter 1, are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. All right, so what happened? They are taken to a foreign land. The Babylonians would come in, and they would take prisoners. They would take the best and the brightest, and they would relocate them back to Babylon, and then they would set them up in a re-education program. They would indoctrinate them, and part of that process was that they gave them new names. Those names were probably names that were related to Babylonian gods. So it was a part of this process of making you a Babylonian servant and to forget your identity, right? So the first thing that happens in chapter 1 of Daniel is Daniel, he goes into this re-education program, and he looks at the food that they're being fed, and he says, I'm not going to defile myself with this food. It doesn't match with my traditions and my customs. So what is he doing? He's not being re-educated. And he tells the supervisor, he says, I'm going to take my guys, and we're going to eat differently. And you can examine us, and if we look better after a week, then you have to let us keep eating our food, right? And it works. So immediately, from day 1, they're setting themselves apart from the rest of the group, right? They're not looking like everyone else. And they immediately get exalted. Their supervisor raises them up, right? So then we go into the second chapter of Daniel. In the second chapter of Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and no one can interpret this dream. And finally, Daniel is brought before the king, and by the power of his God, he interprets the dream. And Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges that only Daniel's God could interpret the dream. So then they get their second promotion, right? Because Daniel is put in charge of the king's court, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are put in charge of the provinces of Babylon. So they've been promoted twice right off the bat, right at the beginning of the book, okay? And they've been set apart from the very beginning. Now, between chapters 2 and 3, there's different estimates. There's a maximum of maybe 20 years that passes, right? So that's quite a bit of time. And we'll start in chapter 3. But the first thing I want to point out is, as we go into chapter 3, the first thing you notice is there's no Daniel. Daniel is absent from chapter 3. Now, as we'll see, the king has summoned all the officials in the land to a field where he has this statue set up. And there's no Daniel because one theory is that Daniel is actually so high up, and he's so in the administrator of the king's court, that he has actually stayed behind in Babylon to rule in the king's stead, as everyone else is absent, right? So he's that high up that he's not even brought to this separate event for all these other political leaders. All right, so starting in Daniel chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, it says, King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue, 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to assemble the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to attend the dedication of the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue the king had set up. Then they stood before the statue Nebuchadnezzar had set up. A herald loudly proclaimed, "People of every nation and language, you are commanded, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, drum, and every kind of music, you are to fall face down and worship the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire." All right. So what do we see here? The first thing that happens is that Nebuchadnezzar has set up this idol. Based on the dream he had in chapter 2, there's a good chance that this idol was an image of himself, right? He has made himself into a god. Now, what's happening here is that this is not actually a religious occurrence. This is actually a test by King Nebuchadnezzar of the devotion and the loyalty of the political structure of Babylon. All right, so what you have here is you have picture, like if we were to put it in our terms, the highest Supreme Court justices and senators all the way down to the lowest police precinct chiefs and fire department, heads. It literally is everybody. Every political figure in the land has been brought to this field to demonstrate their loyalty to the king. Now, the other piece of this is that it was not uncommon in the ancient world, or even throughout some of medieval times, for kings, pharaohs, and emperors to set themselves up as God, right? So this is a test of Nebuchadnezzar to say, I am the God in this land, and you will bow to me. Now, what's the other key here? It's a big ceremony, right? What does this sound like? At the sound of the music, every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that this is Lord, or you'll go into the fiery furnace. Does that sound familiar? That's because the enemy is always taking God's truth and twisting it. He's always taking God's truth and he's given us a counterfeit. And he's saying, if you will worship this counterfeit, then you can avoid the fire. Right? But we know that's a lie, right? Okay, so they have this big ceremony, and then we'll move into verse 8. So in verse 8, it says, in verse 8 it said, some Chaldeans took this occasion to come forward and maliciously accuse the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, may the king live forever. You as king have issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, drum, and every kind of music must fall down and worship the gold statue. Whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. There are some Jews you have appointed to manage the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men have ignored you, the king. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold statue that you set up. All right, who does the Bible say the great accuser is? Satan, right? And if you're not a Christian, then you're automatically a tool of the enemy. And one of the characteristics of being a tool of the enemy is that you're an accuser. You are waiting to accuse children of God, right? Because the enemy is always looking for a reason to point out your flaws. He's always looking for a reason to criticize you and undercut you and hit you at the knees, right? If you're a child of God, the Bible says that the world actively hates you. All right, so have you ever been in a situation where somebody came to you and said something along the lines of, she says you think you're better than everybody else, right? And meanwhile, you're just trying to get through your lunch break, right? So the thing is, these guys, what did we see? Starting in chapter 1, is that they've set themselves apart, right? They've been different. So how easy do you think it would have been the whole time they're going through their re-education program and they keep getting these promotions and you're over here going, my food isn't good enough for you? And you really think you're something, don't you? You really think you're better than me. So they have created this environment just by following God of people that are jealous of them, that hate them, that think these guys really think they're better than us. And now, all of a sudden, you've gone to this ceremony. Everyone's been told to bow down to this idol. You go to bow down, and these three are standing up. And you're like, okay, first you don't eat the food. Now you won't bow to the statue. You really do think you're better than us, right? And this is your chance. This is your chance to accuse them because you've been waiting. You've been waiting for your chance to get rid of them. All right, so moving into verse 13, says, then in a furious rage, Nebuchadnezzar gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar asked them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, is it true that you don't serve my gods or worship the gold statue I have set up? Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, or drum, and every kind of music, fall down and worship the statue I have made. But if you don't worship, you will immediately be thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God who can rescue you from my power? All right, so what's the first thing that happens? Nebuchadnezzar has gone through a lot of trouble. He set up this massive gold statue. He probably had to set it up away from the city so it could be kind of a surprise. It's going to be unveiled for this ceremony. He's gotten together this massive orchestra, right? The biggest one that we've seen. He's brought every single political person in the land to one spot to unveil this statue. And now, you three are ruining his big day. I mean, like you came to my party and now you won't just participate, right? I might be upset myself. So he throws a fit. It says he had rage, and he sent for them to be brought to him. Now, the interesting thing is, he then asked them the question, is it true that you won't do this? But I want you to notice there's no real pause here. He's not actually waiting for an answer. He assumes the obedience. Is it true you won't do this? Because we're going to try again. We're going to try again. We're going to play the music. You're going to bow. You're going to bow. When the music plays, you're going to bow, right? Let's do this, okay? And he's not giving them a chance to talk this through, right? Now, here's the interesting part. The end, there's a challenge. In the end, he sets it up as a God versus God moment. Because he is the God in the land, and he is challenging a God that, by the way, he knows these three men. He knows the God they serve. He's had an experience with this God. And notice how he says it. Here's how he wanted it to sound. He wanted it to come across like this. Your God can't stop me. He wanted to see some fear. He wanted to see them standing there going, we should have just bowed. This is way worse. But here's what actually happened. What actually happened is he went, and your God can't stop me, can he? No? He can't, right? It was false. It was weak. He was questioning his own challenge to Yahweh. That's why he asked it as a question. He's not saying, I know this. He's scared of what's about to happen. And he has challenged Yahweh. And here's the thing, our God doesn't back down from challenges. All right, so moving into verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this question. If the God we serve exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. All right, we're going to stop right there. Something that I noticed as I read through the commentaries for this lesson is that one of the common threads that everyone seemed to agree on is that this is not an arrogant response. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not standing there saying, get out of my face. Our God's going to handle you. What they do is they say, it would sound a lot like this to us. They say, King, guilty as charged. We didn't respect your authority. We didn't do what you told us to do. Because our God is bigger than that fiery furnace. Right? So notice, this is not haughty. It's not prideful or self-righteous. It's just obedience to the God that they know they serve. Now, it's important right now to pause and ask this question. Why not just bow? Why not just bow? I mean, you have three of the highest jobs in the land. You have the most influence you're going to have. You can do a lot more good alive than dead. It's not really that big of a deal. Is God going to just throw you out of heaven? Well, you bowed. That's it for you. You're done. That's not right? That's not how God works. Why not just bow? The reason that Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego didn't bow is because they understood that from day one, they had been setting themselves apart. And if they bowed, the testimony that God had been building in their life for 20 plus years was gone. Their accusers had a win-win going on. If they stay standing, we can finally get rid of them. And if they bow, then are they really better than us? They're afraid of the same God. They're bowing to the same idol. Looks like all that talk was just talk. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego understood that there was something more at stake in this moment, and it was a testimony that their whole life had been built around. The other key thing here is that when we read Bible stories, I mean, if you grew up in church, you heard this story 1,000 times. Obviously, a lot of you watch the VeggieTales, so you know what's going to happen, right? But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't know what was going to happen. They were not aware of how this event was about to unfold, but they focused on things unseen, things bigger than themselves, and obedience to their God above their own personal circumstances, which leads us right into verse 18. Now, here's the deal. If you take nothing else out of tonight, everyone thinks that the fiery furnace is the point. That's the pinnacle moment of this story. Let me tell you, that's not the pinnacle moment of this story. I know that my God can save me from the flames. The pinnacle moment of this story is God-fearing men standing up to evil in the face of certain death. Right, so in verse 18, they say, "But even if he does not rescue us, we want you as king to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." Even if I don't get my dream job, even if I don't get the degree that I think will fulfill me, even if that dream relationship doesn't happen, even if I die, even if my family member dies, God is God. David said, even if I have to run from Saul, God is God. Abraham said, even if I have to sacrifice my son, God is God. Gideon said, even if I'm outnumbered. Noah said, even if I look like a fool. And Jesus said, even if I have to go to the cross, God is God. Do you know the only thing scarier than a world where bad things happen and God's in control is? So you have bad things happen and God's in control. What's scarier than that? Bad things happen and God has no say. God has no effect. God can't stop bad things. That is truly terrifying. That is a paralyzing thought. I don't know how non-Christians get up in the morning. I don't know how you watch the current news cycle and you get out of bed if God's not sovereign. Because God being sovereign is the only thing that guarantees that this whole thing doesn't go up in smoke in the next 5 seconds. Now, one of the big questions is, why would God let bad things happen to good people? Right? You hear that a lot. That's a pretty common objection for non-Christians. If this God is so good, why does he let bad things happen? Because it's not about your circumstances. It's not about the inconveniences or the struggle that you're going through right now. It's about the testimony of the relationship you have with God that draws other people into a relationship with him. What if your pain is what somebody needs to see to say, that God's real and I want him? Now that person gets to go to heaven because you were not focused on your circumstances. You were focused on God. Why do bad things happen to good people? Because it's not about you. Let's talk about Job for a second. Job went through the ringer, right? Horrible things happened to Job. And the point of Job's life was a testimony to the God he followed. The point of Job's life was this relationship he had with God that he wouldn't give up. It was the only thing that mattered. What if you lived an even-if lifestyle? Let's go through this scenario. You're going through something terrible. Fill in the blank, right? We've all been through something. And you go into work, and your coworker, your non-Christian coworker, looks at you and says, "How you feeling?" And you say, "You know what? I'm not feeling very good. This is uncomfortable. It's painful. It's terrible. I wish it would stop. But I know that my God is sovereign." What does that say to that coworker who has no concept of the God that you serve? Now let's do that scenario again. You walk into work, your coworker says, "How you feeling?" And you go, "Wow, you want to go get a drink after work? Because I need to get a drink." Or how about this one? "I just really need to get laid." Now, what have you done? You're no different than them. You're bowing to the same idol. You're avoiding fire with the same falsehood that they're avoiding fire with. Your testimony is wrecked. What if you lived an even-if lifestyle? Moving into verse 19, it says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with rage, and the expression on his face changed toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He gave orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than was customary, and he commanded some of his best soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace of blazing fire. So these men, with their trousers, robes, head coverings, and other clothes, were tied up and thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Since the king's command was so urgent and the furnace extremely hot, the raging flames killed those who were carried Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego up. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the furnace of blazing fire." All right, so let's talk about a couple things. First of all, King Nebuchadnezzar has now transitioned into such a bad temper tantrum, he's not even making rational decisions, all right? This furnace, I read in one commentary, would have been set baseline, normal, at 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, right? I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure no one can live through that. So what does 7 times that do? Nothing, right? That's just somebody pitching a fit, right? And what does that fit cost him? Some of his best soldiers die, right? Now, here's the thing you need to understand. I don't know who was here when Philip talked about Lazarus, but one of the mind-blowing moments of that sermon was he talked about how they came to Jesus and they said, "Lazarus is sick." And Jesus waits a couple days, and then he goes to see Lazarus. And in between the time he finds out about Lazarus and the time he goes to see Lazarus, Lazarus dies. Right? And what Philip said about that passage is he said that sometimes God lets things get worse before he gets involved. And why does he do that? There's 2 reasons. One, because the worse the situation is, the more glorifying God is by it being fixed. And second of all, you can't take any credit. Lazarus comes back from being sick. Well, maybe he just got better. Lazarus comes back from the dead. He didn't just get better. So in this situation, you now have this 1,800 degree Fahrenheit times 7 furnace. They're tied up, and literally the guys carrying them die just from the heat. What we have here is a hopeless situation. This is as bad as it gets. There's no coming back from this, right? Now, one thing we need to do is we need to pause, and we need to ask ourselves this. What if the story ended right here? Is God less God if they burn in the fiery furnace? I struggled with this at one point. I looked at the Job story, and I thought, what if the story ends with Job at his lowest, and it just cuts off right there? We don't have the the end of that book, right? And then I realized something. God intentionally gives us the end of these stories because he is showing us what kind of God he is. It's not about you, it's about God. And that's beautiful because of the kind of God we serve. You can have confidence in making it about God because he shows us time and time again that the story doesn't end when they fall into the furnace. Right? So we go to the next section. Verse 24. Then King Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in alarm. He said to his advisors, "Didn't we throw 3 men bound into the fire?" "Yes, of course, your majesty," they replied to the king. He exclaimed, "Look, I see 4 men not tied walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and called, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the Most High God, come out." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. When the satraps, prefects, governors, and the king's advisors gathered around, they saw that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men. Not a hair on their heads was singed, their robes were unaffected, and there was no smell of fire on them. Nebuchadnezzar exclaimed, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel and rescued his servants who trusted in him. They violated the king's command and risked their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I issue a decree that anyone of any people, nation, or language who says anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be torn limb from limb, and his house will be made into a garbage dump. For there is no other God who is able to deliver like this." Then the king rewarded Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. All right. So what's the first thing that happens? King Nebuchadnezzar jumps up and he goes, how many people did we throw in? And they go, 3. And he's like, because I see 4. And not only do I see 4, but they're moving around, right? They're untied. They're walking around in this absurdly hot fire. Now, on top of that, the question is, who's this 4th person, right? So I read some commentaries on this as well. The first thing we need to discuss is that it's not necessarily important how Nebuchadnezzar describes what he's seeing, right? Because his lens on what he's seeing is pagan, right? He can only describe it to the best of his knowledge, and he doesn't have a knowledge of the one true God in a way that would allow him to know what's going on, right? But the language here is interesting because it says a son of the gods, and another translation is a son of the Most High God or a son of a deity, right? So what he's saying is he's not just seeing something supernatural, he is seeing a God, right? So the question arises, is this an angel or is this a pre-incarnate Jesus Christ? So I'm going to flip over really fast to Isaiah 43, verses 1 through 3. Now, the common consensus is that this, by the early church fathers and some of the oldest theologians, is that this is a pre-incarnate Jesus. And if we look at Isaiah 43, verse 1 through 3, it says, "Now this is what the Lord says, the one who created you, Jacob, and the one who formed you, Israel. Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by your name, and you are mine. I will be with you when you pass through the waters and when you pass through the rivers. They will not overwhelm you. You will not be scorched when you walk through the fire, and the flame will not burn you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, and your Savior. And I have given Egypt as a ransom for you." Here's the bottom line. We serve a God who gets involved personally in what's going on with us. We don't serve this Zeus-like bearded deity that goes, "Well, that looks bad. Good luck." That's not the God of this Bible. That's not the God we serve. This God takes it personally. This God has a vested interest in your life. And when you are going through fire, he's there too. Some of you remember when we went on the Reach Retreat and I talked about Peter walking on the water. And the interesting thing about that is that when Peter climbs out of the boat, the storm doesn't stop, right? He walks on the water, but the storm is raging around him. But the only thing Peter's focused on in those first moments is Jesus. And because he's focused on Jesus, the storm has no effect. Notice that Nebuchadnezzar, he has to call them out of the fire. The fire isn't bothering them because they're spending every spare second they've got in the presence of Jesus, and they don't care what else is going on. When you start to see eternal things, when you start to see unseen things, and you focus on Jesus, the fires don't matter. The storms don't matter. You don't drown. You don't burn. You don't die, because God is there with you, walking you through it. He's a God that takes it personally. And then what happens? Nebuchadnezzar immediately acknowledges the authority of the Most High God, the only God that can deliver. Because they would not disobey God, a proclamation is made throughout the land that involves punishment. If you so much as say something against this God, I'll rip you limb from limb and will turn your house into a pile of garbage. All from obedience. They could have just knelt. They could have just spent the rest of their lives living in comfort. What is the very last verse of the chapter? They're rewarded in the province of Babylon. See, we got to get over this idea that I can somehow manipulate the situation and make it beneficial to me. You're not smart enough to figure out your way through whatever you're going through whatever the circumstance is. You're not going to beat it. But the beautiful thing is you don't have to, because you have this sovereign God that loves you, and he's got the whole thing mapped out. And what did we talk about? We talked with Job, and we talked with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The God of this Bible shows us that he doesn't just end the story with us falling into the fiery furnace. Listen, if you hear this tonight and it's foreign to you, you don't have any concept of this relationship with this God who's coming alongside of you, find somebody in this room. We'll introduce you. We'll make all the introductions, because, again, I don't know how you're getting up in the morning. And I want you to know the God that I serve. If you are a Christian, we need to talk about the difference between justification and sanctification. You can be justified for your whole life, and you'll go to heaven. But until you start living an even-if life that's focused on being sanctified and Jesus walking me through the fire, you're going to be miserable. You're going to live this life not to the real potential that God has for you in it. So don't leave here tonight. If you don't know Jesus Christ, find somebody who will introduce you to him. And if you do know him, and there's something that you've excluded from your even if, right? God's God unless this happens. No. God is God even if that happens. Deal with that. Deal with that thing that God suddenly won't be God if that goes down. Dear God, I want to thank you for tonight. I want to thank you for the group we had. Lord, tonight started off in a rough place that we wouldn't have expected, and we want to pray for the Jackson family moving forward. But Lord, I just want to thank you for your presence, for your blessings, for your peace, even in the midst of that crisis, even in this crazy, absurd year of 2020. I pray that as this year continues to unfold, as this community bonds and is closer and faces these challenges together, I pray that we begin to learn to live even if lives. I pray all these things in your name. Amen.
What's up, everybody? This is Philip Jackson, pastor of young adults at Evergreen Church. I want to invite you to come to Reach. We meet every Tuesday evening at 6:30 at Evergreen Church, just east of Mingo on 111th Street. For more information, check out our website, reachtulsa.org. You can connect with us on social media and on Instagram by searching for reach.tulsa. Also, be sure to subscribe to our content for the latest sermons and updates. You can also find us on Spotify, iTunes, and wherever you find your favorite podcasts.
Bring your glory down. Come fill your people with revival sound. Oh, rain down your fire. Come ignite our hearts. May we burn for you, Lord, like a million stars. Like a million stars. Whoa, whoa, whoa. We see